Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Lisa Carney, and I am requesting $500,000 in grant funding to support a trauma-informed public health mitigation initiative, addressing an under-recognized consequence of intimate partner violence, the institutional pathologization of mothers who disclose abuse. Today I will demonstrate why this constitutes a population-level epidemiologic problem, why it remains unaddressed by current policies, and how targeted investment can prevent avoidable harm to women and children. Intimate partner violence affects over 1 in 3 women in the United States, representing more than 43.5 million nationwide. In the past year alone, 6.7 million women experienced interpersonal violence, demonstrating that this is not a historical issue, but an ongoing public health emergency. The economic burden of interpersonal violence is estimated at $3.6 trillion over survivors' lifetimes, largely driven by medical care, lost productivity, and prolonged legal system involvement. However, these figures dramatically underestimate the true burden because secondary institutional harms are not counted. When mothers disclose interpersonal violence and are subsequently diagnosed with personality disorders, labeled emotionally unstable or deemed unfit parents, these outcomes are not tracked by surveillance systems, yet they produce measurable morbidity for both women and children. This gap represents a classic epidemiologic blind spot harm. Harm exists, but we fail to measure it. Using an epidemiologic framework, intimate partner violence functions as the agent of disease. Interpersonal violence includes not only physical violence, but coercive control and psychological aggression. Forms of abuse that leave no visible injuries but produce significant trauma responses. The hosts most vulnerable to secondary harm are mothers of minor children, low-income women, women of color, and survivors involved in custody disputes. The environment in which pathologization occurs is critical. Family courts, forensic mental health evaluations, and health care settings frequently divorce trauma symptoms from their cause, interpreting distress, fear, or hypervigilance as evidence of pathology rather than survival. When agent, host, and environment interact in this way, secondary harm becomes predictable. The CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey is the gold standard for interpersonal violence surveillance. However, it does not measure what happens after disclosure, specifically how often survivors are psychiatrically diagnosed, medically discredited, or legally penalized from an epidemiological standpoint. This introduces systemic misclassification bias. Diagnosis is applied in forensic or court-connected contexts are rarely evaluated for validity and are especially unreliable when trauma exposure is ignored. Public health cannot intervene in what it does not measure. As a result, harmful institutional practices replicate unchecked across jurisdictions. Pathologization is not a neutral administrative outcome. It is itself a determinant of health. When mothers are labeled unstable or disordered following interpersonal violence disclosure, the consequences include heightened psychological distress, delayed or avoided help seeking, increased legal vulnerability, and loss of child custody or forced separation. Children pay the price through disrupted caregiving relationships, instability, and long-term developmental risk. These outcomes represent secondary disease burden, created not by interpersonal violence, but by system response. Existing research clearly documents gender bias in psychiatric diagnosis. Disproportionate custody loss when mothers raise abuse concerns and mental health deterioration associated with legal and institutional betrayal. What is missing are interventions aimed at system behavior rather than survivor compliance. There are no standardized trauma-informed safeguards governing diagnostic practice in court-linked contexts. The gap is not theoretical. It produces measurable, preventable harm. I propose funding the Trauma-Informed Disclosure Safeguard Protocol, or TIDSP, a system-level mitigation strategy designed to prevent diagnostic misuse following interpersonal violence disclosure. The protocol includes mandatory interpersonal violence-specific trauma-informed training for clinicians and forensic evaluators. Diagnostic safeguards that prohibit personality-based diagnoses within 12 months of interpersonal violence disclosure unless strict, independent criteria are met. Clinical context statements requiring evaluators to document violence exposure alongside symptoms. Survivor advocacy integration during high-stakes assessments. This approach does not restrict clinical judgment. Instead, it restores epidemiological validity and prevents diagnosis from becoming a tool of social control. From a public health perspective, this intervention functions by interrupting a harmful causal pathway. Currently, disclosure leads to trauma responses which are misclassified as pathology, resulting in legal and health consequences. The TIDSP disrupts misclassification, addresses structural determinants, and improves downstream maternal and child outcomes. This aligns with the core epidemiologic goals of harm reduction, equity, and prevention. Compared to the $100,000 lifetime cost per survivor, this investment is modest, and the potential return in prevented harm is substantial. The first $500,000 request is strategically designed to maximize public health impact while minimizing cost. The largest allocation supports training and personnel, ensuring evaluators and clinicians are equipped with trauma-informed interpersonal violence-specific competencies. This directly addresses diagnostic misuse at its source. Funds dedicated to protocol development establish standardized safeguards that can be replicated nationally. Pilot implementation across 3 jurisdictions allows for real-world testing in diverse settings. Importantly, nearly $70,000 are reserved for evaluation and outcomes analysis, ensuring that this initiative produces measurable, epidemiologically valid results, particularly across race, income, and geography. Finally, dissemination funding ensures scalability far beyond the pilot sites, allowing a single investment to influence national practice. Relative to the $100,000 lifetime cost per survivor, this is a cost-effective prevention strategy. In closing, intimate partner violence is not only about what happens behind closed doors. It is about what happens when someone asks for help. When systems respond by pathologizing mothers, we amplify harm, undermine child safety, and deepen inequity. This outcome is preventable. With targeted investment, we can ensure that disclosure becomes a pathway to protection, not punishment. I respectfully urge you to fund the Trauma-Informed Disclosure Safeguard protocol and help transform system response into a public health success. Thank you for your time and consideration.